you can head down and enjoy. Thank you for being here this morning. We will continue looking at the book of Ephesians this summer. When we were planning these at the beginning of the summer and figuring out when Thomas was going to be gone, and he sent me the passages of where we would be in this sequence of through Ephesians. And the comment he made was, hey, it just happened to be the weeks he was gone. There are some lengthy passages to preach through the next 2 weeks. So again, I've had a great experience preparing to share these with you, and hope that what I've learned and what the Word has revealed speaks to you as it has to me this morning. In the book of Revelation, we're not going into the book of Revelation today, don't worry. But at the beginning of that book, there are 7 letters written to 7 churches throughout that Middle East area of the world. And these letters take a moment through this revelation to talk about the strengths and weaknesses of these church communities and some things that they can do to walk more like Jesus taught them to. Sometimes I feel like Ephesians is an 8th letter, that maybe this is a letter written to the Church of America. But then as I thought about that, I don't know that that's really enough. And so then I was thinking maybe it's a letter written to the church of the 21st century. It's like, well, I'm sure there were a lot of people in previous centuries that really benefited from this letter. But it really seems like a letter for all of those who follow Jesus, pointing out the strengths and weaknesses of our walk and the things that we can do to more closely honor our following of Jesus through this crazy world that we are living in. An important note of the book of Ephesians coming into this part, the previous sections that Thomas had been teaching on are the theology of Paul in presenting Ephesians. And these closing chapters of Ephesians are really the practical teaching. Okay, now that you have some understanding, what are you going to do with it? What's life really going to look like? So as we go into these closing chapters of Ephesians, that's where we're at in this practical aspect of Paul's teachings in Ephesians. Today we're going to read Ephesians chapter 4, the first 16 verses. Would you stand with me as we read the word of the Lord? Paul writes, "Prisoner for the Lord, then, I urge you to live a life worthy of the calling you have received. Be completely humble and gentle. Be patient, bearing with one another in love. Make every effort to keep the unity of the Spirit through the bond of peace. There is one body and one Spirit, just as you were called to one hope when you were called. One Lord, one faith, one baptism, one God and Father of all, who is over all and through all and in all. But to each one of us he has given as Christ apportioned it. This is why it says, when he ascended on high, he took many captives and gave gifts to his people. What does he ascend mean except that he also descended to the lower earthly regions? He who descended is the very one who ascended higher than all the heavens in order to fill the whole universe. So Christ himself gave the apostles, the prophets, the evangelists, the pastors, and teachers to equip his people for works of service, so that the body of Christ may be built up until we reach unity in faith and in the knowledge of the Son of God and become mature, attaining to the whole measure of the fullness of Christ. Then we will no longer be infants, tossed back and forth by the waves, and blown here and there by every wind of teaching, and by the cunning and craftiness of people and their deceitful scheming. Instead, speak the truth in love. We will grow to become, in every respect, the mature body of him who is the head, that is Christ. From him the whole body, joined and held together by every supporting ligament, grows and builds itself up in love. Each part does its work. This is the word of the Lord. You may be seated. So this passage starts with the imprisoned Paul urging God's people to live differently. Now, there's some debate in the theological world about the church in Ephesus and what they're doing. But my thought is, some of these things Paul's not going to write to them if there's not some sort of issue to address. He's writing them to correct things that they're already doing well. This is a reminder. This is a, hey, you might be veering a little off course here. But it says he does this with urgency. He sees that a little degree off track over time can lead us further away than we would want to be from following a life of living with Jesus. And he starts by asking us to do one thing, and that is to live worthy of the calling you have received. The other verses are just how we are to do that. And so I want to look at this idea of living into a calling. And I'm sure that many of us don't feel like we have a calling. And I think that is an issue with the English translation of this particular word, which really does mean if you have a specific assignment that God has directed you to do as a calling. That is true. That is part of what this word means. But Paul was so good at using words that spoke to people at different points in their life, and then also spoke to a whole population. And this word was often used to identify what you would call yourself, what you would like to be labeled as. So we might say what you have chosen to call yourself, not by name, but like by what you're associating yourself to. If you're choosing to be labeled, be called a Christian, or you're choosing to call yourself a Christian, that's the calling Paul's putting in front of all of us here. If we are being called Christian, we then have this recipe of sorts of what it looks like to live up to that calling. So if you've read this passage before and you stopped there and said, well, I'm not called into ministry, I don't have a specific calling, I don't need to do the rest of this, I'm sorry, that's not correct. Calling yourself a follower of Jesus is the calling that Paul is asking us to take more seriously. He's asking us to live our entire lives in a way that honors and lifts up that calling. When we get to verse 2, sometimes I read these and I think it seems so simple. Be humble and gentle. I don't know that that's as simple as those words just roll off of our tongue as we read verse 2. I was reading a survey that the Episcopal Church did in 2022, asking both Christians and non-Christians how they viewed people who called themselves Christians. And the Christians describing themselves said they were compassionate, loving, respectful, and friendly. And those who did not call themselves Christians, but had some association with Christians, talked about hypocrisy and being judgmental, self-righteous, and arrogant. And every time I read those kinds of things, it hits me that there's a disconnect between who we as the church, big picture church, thinks we are versus how we are being seen in our cultures and circumstances and societies. I have a problem with that. And it's not that I want us to look like the world. I think we're doing a pretty good job of looking like the world if we look at the statistics around divorce and drug and alcohol abuse and many of those sorts of things are becoming more and more like the world statistically. But what Paul is asking us to do is to live a life that reveals such a different, drastic, and dramatic life that people says, oh, that's Jesus. That they see Jesus. They see the traits of Jesus when they look at who we are as individuals and as a group. In a sense, Paul's asking us to change the way in which we live and not just color the way that we live. Do we have the appearance of Christianity in our lives? Or is there dramatic change to live like Christ? And the first way that Paul asks us to consider living that would represent that is to be humble and gentle. Like in the Roman world, and I think this is true today, humility is not something most people strive for. In the Roman world, you gained success the less humble you were. You needed to be a self-aggrandizing personality to make a difference. And so that trait was seen as very valuable in that today. And I think in a lot of ways, that is true in our circumstance, in our society. The problem is what that did in Roman times, and certainly does now, that leads a lot of people to pretend to be someone they're not in order to have that kind of impression. So here's Paul asking us to do something the opposite of that. If we are to follow Jesus, we are to live a life of humbleness. If we believe in the powers that Jesus had and the things that he did on earth, he could have, if he wanted to go out and be a celebrity and do the things he could have done, yeah, he could have done that, no problem. But that's not the life that he chose to live. That's not the life that he was called to live. And if we're to follow him, pursuing humility in our life is important. One of the reasons I think that humility gets pushed to the side by Christians often is because the synonyms of that word aren't necessarily things that we want to be. And some people, when they hear humble, they think of timid or cowardice. And it's just not the idea that this humility and gentleness is trying to talk about. What this is really trying to get at is our ability to relate to someone without harshness or aggression. One example given by one of the commentators I was reading spoke to me well because it's using language we hear a lot today. And he said, a humble and gentle person would not insist that his rights prioritize at the expense of someone else. To be humble and gentle means that every relationship that we have, whether that be intimate or whether that be just in passing, is done without harshness or aggression, but with love and care and compassion. And there's just no room in that to be selfish and to have vengeance. The idea of revenge always sticks out to me in this conversation. There's no place for that in a humble and gentle spirit that we live in through Christ. The next little passage here talks about to bear with each other in love. And we don't use that word bear in this context very often. So just the dictionary definition is to endure something unpleasant or difficult. Here's Paul writing to the church in Ephesus and writing lessons that we can learn today, saying we are to bear with each other. We are to take each other's unpleasant and difficult interactions and deal with it. We don't like to deal with those sorts of things. We don't want to deal with those sorts of things. In fact, many of us do our very best to avoid relationships with people that cause us to have to bear with them. But real relationships, we can value the diversity of thought, the diversity of our ability to interact with people that rub us the wrong way, that become difficult, that try our nerves. We are to bear with them in love, not just to bear with them, but to bear with them in love in a way that is compassionate. Patience is a word that sticks out to me in there. I don't think Paul is necessarily making a comment on parenting, but we have to bear with our kids sometimes when they're difficult and unpleasant. If that's an example of bearing with someone, we need to have that kind of relationship, that kind of willingness to bear with others in love and patience and compassion. And when we consider the church as a whole, the diversity that we will find all over the world, those with the calling that we have to be Christians, to be followers of Jesus, that diversity will require us to be people who bear with one another. It's the opposite of this new term that people are using a lot these days, that's cancel culture. Cancel culture says when someone becomes difficult, they're out. You have nothing to do with them anymore. And it just stands in direct opposition to Paul's teaching that the followers of Jesus will bear with one another in love. We will take on people's difficulties. We will take on the unpleasantness to be one. The whole middle of this passage that we read today is talking about the one. The one thing we all have in common is everything who God says that he is and what he does. And one baptism, and one word, and one faith. When we have that similar calling, we are gentle and humble, and we bear with each other. It's a drastically different life than what we see in the world around us, who we get this idea that we want to not be humble and gentle, and that we want to cancel people out of our lives. And that's just not the way of Jesus. We seem very quick, like we don't have the patience to even get to the point of bearing with people. And it's something I think that is going to take practice. And there's so many issues that we can practice with. How do we do with those who think differently than us politically? What about people who think differently about the Bible than we do, yet have the same calling? A big debate in the Nazarene church is going around right now globally about sexuality and gender. What are we going to do with this idea of being gentle and humble and bearing with one another when these important and divisive content come into our relationships. People who worship differently than we do. There's no qualification in these statements from Paul that allow us to take the opportunity to say, I'm going to bear with everyone in love except. When we're called to be humble and gentle, the word that Paul uses is completely. It's not sometimes. It's not when it's easy. Even the sinners love those who love them. Jesus says in the Sermon on the Mount, we are to love our enemies. Because even the sinners, the normal people, the easy way of living that is not drastically different from the world is to love those who love you. We need to be people that live dramatic and different lives from those around us. Jesus has a great example of this, and this passage crosses my mind regularly. In Mark chapter 9, we see this interaction between Jesus and the disciples. It reads like this, starting in verse 38. "Teacher," said John, "we saw someone driving out demons in your name, and we told him to stop because he was not one of us." Jesus replies, "Don't stop him. For no one who does a miracle in my name can in the next moment say anything bad about me. For whoever is not against us is for us. Truly I tell you, anyone who gives you a cup of water in my name because you belong to the Messiah will certainly not use their reward." It's a powerful statement that Jesus stands up and says, people are going to do it differently than we do. But when they have the calling that we have to be followers of Jesus, if that's where we're really rooted in that, those people are going to care for Jesus just like we care for Jesus. He shows them that this idea of looking at ourselves with the people that we're with being this and everything else not. Jesus says, no, when we share a calling, we love and we're compassionate and we're humble and we're gentle and we bear with one another. And there is no option to not do that. We endure the unpleasant, the frustrating, the different, the difficult, those who we would say are wrong, the other side, and we do so with compassion and patience. And passion, that works too. I just put those two words together. The cool part about all of this is that it's impossible to do on our own. Some of the things that we sang about this morning kind of reveal that aspect of who Jesus is when he comes and he prepares us to be those people. How much fighting is going on inside of us when we sing about the grace and mercy of the Lord that we've received. And yet many of our relationships are full of selfishness and revenge and labeling and making people other. Too much thought about me being right and them being wrong. You notice that's not a part of this discussion? It's not a part of when Paul in the book of Galatians reveals this great truth about the fruit of the Spirit, that when people live within the Spirit, there are these 9 traits that they exhibit. And it's not that they're 9 different fruits. It's 9 aspects of the same fruit. None of them talk about being right, being correct, having it all put together. It's all about the way in which we relate to God and we relate to others. As we move towards the end of this passage, we read that Christ gave to us, the apostles, the prophets, evangelists, the pastors, and the teachers, to equip his people for works of service, so that the body of Christ may be built up until we reach unity in faith, knowledge of the Son of God, and become mature. And what that looks like is we will no longer then be infants. We will no longer be tossed back and forth by the waves, and we will no longer be blown here and there by every wind of teaching and cunning craftiness of people and their deceitful scheming. This is about spiritual maturity, not about physical maturity. So age has nothing to do with this necessarily. But Paul reveals here that the sign of a mature Christian is in their unity of faith, their knowledge of Jesus, and their ability to stand and not be blown about by every wind of change, not have every wave hit us and knock us off path and cause us to be selfish and full of vengeance. This sign of maturity is that we are anchored to being people of gentleness and humility that bear with one another in love. It's so easy to want to disconnect these two parts of this passage. To say, okay, we can be mature and gentle, humble, and bear with people things. And they're only like 8 verses away from each other. There's no intent here to think about spiritual maturity away from being gentle and humble and bearing with one another. And so maybe we have to do this hard work as individuals and as a congregation and as a global church of really looking at our spiritual maturity. And does our maturity that we think that we have reflect what the Bible actually teaches that spiritual maturity looks like? It doesn't tell us that being a Bible scholar means you are spiritually mature. It doesn't mean that being a leader means you're spiritually mature. One of the things that we're called to do as spiritually mature people is to speak the truth in love. And again, when I hear that phrase, when I hear people use that phrase, it's just to me like hearing no offense, but. When I hear someone say no offense, but, I'm preparing to be offended. When I hear people say, I need to speak the truth in love, I'm prepared to feel unloved. And it's so backwards because we want to take this little phrase out of the context of this whole lesson that Paul's presenting and think that speaking the truth in love can be anything but gentle and humble and bearing with one another. That's different than being permissive. It's different than I hear it a lot that Christians who live this way are weak on sin. No, they're not. There's a way that Christ taught us to live where we can speak the truth in love. That doesn't lead people to think, oh no, I'm about to not be loved when that phrase shows up. This idea of being people who are mature, not knocked from side to side by the waves and the wind, cannot be separated from the call to be gentle and humble and bearing with one another in love. It is a huge change in lifestyle for most people. And thankfully, he's not asking us to do that alone. He's not writing this to one person in the church in Ephesus. He's writing to the whole church saying, hey, you, as a body of believers, need to drastically change the way in which you live to live like Jesus lived. And the only way for you to do that is to be solid in your faith, which is trust, and to know Jesus. That sign of maturity is found in faith, knowing Jesus. How do we pursue that as individuals and as a group? How do we desire to become truly spiritually mature together? The first thing that we have to do is we have to step back and we have to look at our own maturity and decide where we need some work. It's really hard to look in the mirror and say, I maybe am not as spiritually mature as I thought I was. That when these waves come up, I get excited and I act differently. When issues come up, when there's things that come up that I disagree with, you notice Paul's not saying don't disagree with those things. Okay, he's recognizing we're going to think different things. But it's the way in which we relate to the world that is this drastic way of living differently. If there's a sense within us of defensiveness as we're considering our spiritual maturity, if we're like, no, it's not right for me to be gentle and humble and bear with one another. That sense of defensiveness, I always believe, is a sense that the Holy Spirit is speaking. Is trying to get our attention in a way that says, what do we really need to hear from Jesus? What do we really need to know? How do we need to relate to him so that we can have this joy and this peace and this life? Self-reflection is not a bad thing. Congregational reflection is not a bad thing. Finding yourself in a spot where you have been hit by a wave and realizing that you have been knocked by this wave is a good point to stop and say, wait a sec, I can fix that. And double down on your faith and pursue Jesus in a way that maybe is different or maybe that is more than what you have in the past, than what we as a collective group of people in this community or globally as a church. And remember, Jesus set all of this up. This idea of doing this together. He gave us that list of people, of prophets and evangelists and pastors and teachers, so that we don't have to do this alone. So that when we come together as a group, we become more mature and we see people together living like Christ calls us to live. When I do this in my own life, I see a couple things. I see my maturity being in places where I let the church, not just Zillah Nazarene Church, when I let the church speak into my life in areas, I find more maturity. And the places where I keep my thoughts to myself, or to other sources, or other things have authority, I turn into those portions of my life and I find areas where I'm not mature. And I think the more that me and us and we and globally can tear that wall down of ignoring our immaturity in Christ, we can begin to reveal drastically different lives where people see us. And when we take the surveys again, they say, oh, we see humble and gentle and loving and compassionate and patient and generous people. That have a commitment to live their lives differently because the one that they are following, the one that they put their faith in, the one that they are letting have authority in their life is Christ. As the praise team comes up to lead us in a closing song, I have one last thought. And that is that this idea requires us to be vulnerable It requires us to realize that this is not easy and that we need to do it together. That is why Jesus put the church together the way in which he did. We stand and sing with us as we close the service this morning.